So ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, welcome to our next SETS Online webinar. Great that you're here. I'm Ola Kicin, and I'm talking to you from Newcastle University. And before we will start with our webinar, I want to thank you, as always, our sponsors, EIS, which makes this webinar possible free of charge, but also offers a lot of different resources, web resources, and organizes coffee breaks. So please be sure to check one of these, and you may also participate in any coffee break you would like during the week. Our guest today, our speaker, is Jake Kovold, and he's a senior research scientist at the Bureau of Economic Geology, Jackson School of Geoscience at Austin. He's the leader of the Quantitative Classics Laboratory. I think this is what he mentioned. He's not the only leader there, but he will tell you all about it himself. And he works with deep water depositional systems and sort-to-sink sediment dispersal. He has a BSc and PhD degrees in geological and environmental sciences from Stanford University. And in between his PhD and his present position, he was a senior research scientist at Chevron Energy Technology Company and served in the Department of the Interior at the US Geological Survey. He will be talking today about submarine channels, meandering, and salt-basin filling. And I'm pretty sure that you just can't wait to hear about these amazing animations that are just so capturing. One thing I should not forget, but I always do, please remember that during the webinar, the chat will be closed, and we will open the chat at the end, so you will be able to ask your questions. So yeah, thank you very much. And Jake, the stage is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. So yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to share some of the research that our lab's been pursuing. That was a very nice introduction. And I'm not just running this lab at UT Austin by myself. The co-PI for our lab is Zoltan Sylvester, and this work that I'm going to show you is really a collaboration between Zoltan and me, and then a couple of other of our colleagues, a couple of students that we work with as well. What's this all about? I have like a general title. It's about submarine channel meandering and then how it relates to salt basin filling. And this animation is kind of illustrating what I'm going to be talking about. We're interpreting seismic reflection data in the Campos salt basin, and then we're going into a lot of detail to pick out individual channelized elements and analyze their kinematic evolution, similar to what you can do with rivers. So before getting into the nitty-gritty of the talk, I want to highlight our sponsors of our lab that over the last couple of years that have funded this research, and so you can see them all there. And then I also want to acknowledge the partner lab at the UT Austin's Bureau of Economic Geology. This partner lab is called the Applied Geodynamics Lab, and they basically specialize in salt tectonics. And the PI for that lab is Mike Hudek. And without collaborating with Mike Hudek and a former postdoc of theirs named Dan Carruthers, as well as a couple of folks that work with their lab, the AGL, Jill Apps and Frank Peel, whom you all heard from last week. They provided a lot. They provided assistance with respect to context of the basin, how salt tectonics work, because I'm a deep water sedimentologist, not a structural geologist. Then this work really wouldn't have been possible. And then, of course, I want to highlight the co-authors of this work. I mentioned Zoltan before, and then a couple of students that we work with. John Cahan, who worked with us a few years ago as a master's student, and Dallas Dunlap, who's like a seismic visualization expert, but then he's also on the side working on a PhD at UT Austin. And then the data, I want to mention that the data that we're going to be working with, the seismic reflection data, are PGS is allowing us to use the data, and then they've also given us permission to present it today. So there's lately a lot of opportunity to investigate how rivers meander and how rivers evolve over time as a result of the the availability of Landsat imagery, like what you're seeing here. This is an animation that's put together by Zoltan of the Rio Mamoré in the Amazon basin in South America. And it's just a number of Landsat images stitched, illustrating a time-lapse evolution of this river. And so you get a lot of insights into how the banks are changing over time, over decades, and then how bars are deposited. And it gives you insights into not just the geomorphic evolution, but also the geometries of the deposits, the bar forms, and then how they change over time and their preservation. And so we're learning a lot. We've always had the ability to learn a lot about rivers because they're right there on land. You can look at them, and this is just helping even more. So these repeat time-lapse images. And it's not so easy in deep water. This is an article that was published in like some online BBC site that was talking about submarine canyon channel systems that feed submarine fans and the sediment gravity flows and other types of subaqueous mass movements that shape the geomorphology of the seafloor and form those deep water depositional systems. They're underwater. We don't have repeat Landsat images to track how they're changing over time, although, people have been actually surveying lately some of these types of systems to see how they're changing. But it's a little bit more difficult, right? It's underwater. So besides just people that are actually these amazing researchers that are going out and actually repeat surveying some of these submarine systems, there's also an opportunity to look at the stratigraphic record of some of these turbidite systems, particularly more aggregational depositional systems, to understand how they're evolving over time in a way that's kind of similar to what's possible by looking at repeat Landsat images from satellites, right, of rivers. So there's this opportunity I want to highlight in the context of submarine channels and looking at aggregational submarine channel systems. And so this is an example from the relatively flat basin floor in the eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico, passive margin. This black here is the seafloor seismic reflection. This is seismic reflection data. And there's a really thick, hundreds of meters thick, levee bounded submarine channel system. And because it's really aggregational, it's hundreds of meters thick, all these high amplitude discontinuous seismic reflections are like channel element deposits that are stacked one upon the other. You can actually start to map out individual channel elements and reconstruct their like time-lapse evolution, similar to what you can do for rivers. And that's actually something that one of our graduate students named Paul Morris has been working on, and in collaboration with me and the rest in our lab. Before I go on, so this is kind of like an outline slide. And so before I go into the outline of the talk, beyond just advocating for these aggregational submarine channel systems as providing the opportunity to reconstruct channel kinematics in deep water, I want to highlight some other cool stuff in this seismic reflection profile. So there's that big aggregational channel system with the beautiful gull wing levee stratigraphy here, forming this lenticular package. But then there are other earlier levee channel systems. There are these discontinuous high amplitude seismic reflections here that are what we're interpreting to be like weakly confined channels that feed depositional lobes, approximate a fan shape in aggregate. And then there are these features that form the continental margin, continental rise stratigraphic record too, and big portions of it. These are mass transport complexes. So they're a result of subaqueous landslides. All right, back to what the heck we're talking about, and not all the other cool stuff on this slide. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to, we're interested in evaluating the kinematic evolution of submarine channels, and a good starting place is to evaluate the plan view evolution of like rivers. And so how do rivers evolve over time, and then how does that compare to submarine channels? So I'm going to have a little section about that, a real quick primer, and then we're going to dive into these data that we've been working in the Campos Basin. And this is a little bit more complex because it's not a simple flat basin floor topography. There's a lot of topographic complexity as a result of salt diapirism. So not only are we going to ask is the meandering of submarine channels similar to rivers in a simple passive margin, but is it similar in a margin where there's a lot of complex topography and active tectonics? And if so, why the heck is it? And then if not, why not, right? So another thing I want to highlight is you don't just have aggregational channels in flat basin floors of passive margins, you also have them in tectonically active settings. So here's an example that we're not really going to talk about beyond just this slide showing an aggregational submarine channel and a salt basin, but here's an example from the Campos Basin. To the left is a cross section AA prime, and then AA prime is the location of the cross section in a map view context. And then these polygons that are pink and red, those are the traces of the of these channel forms in map view. Okay, so what I'm going to show is an animation from the bottom of this stack of channel deposits. The bottom of this stack of channel deposits, you're going to see what it looks like in an RMS amplitude extraction in a map view on the right here, and then you're going to see how it's stacking and vertically aggrading like 500 meters in cross section. So here's what the bottom of the system looks like. And then I've highlighted the channel morphology with some dashed lines, and you can see this thing developing sinuosity, and it's also, aggrading and stacking, and the whole aggradation of the system is like 500 meters. Okay, so you can get aggradational channel systems, and it's just inherent to deep water environments for reasons that I can happy to entertain if people have questions at the end of the talk. So I want to go over, so we're interested in the channel evolution, right? Submarine channel evolution. But let's start with what we think we know about the kinematics of rivers and how that might relate to submarine channels. So, how the heck how do rivers meander? Okay, so this is an example that this is an animation that Zoltan, my colleague, of course, put together from the Ucayali River in the Amazon basin. And it's just showing like decades of evolution of this river. And you can see how the different banks change. The outer bank, there's more erosion on an outer bank, more deposition on an inner bank. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how rivers meander because I think Zoltan's lined up to give a talk to your group like in the next few months. So I don't want to like steal his thunder or anything. So I'm doing like this as fast and simple as I can to not, to give Zoltan an opportunity to talk about this in a heck of a lot more detail. So basically, as you're seeing this just run on a loop, the way that rivers meander is generally you get erosion on an outer bank and you get deposition on an inner bank, and the deposition of bar forms. And this sort of asymmetry of erosion and deposition results from asymmetry in flow velocity and result in shear stress in these curved channel segments. Generally, the larger the curvature of these channels, the larger the centrifugal force, and then you'll get larger shear stress on the outer banks. So if you have a bend with really high curvature, you should expect to have much higher migration rates. And that's kind of true. There's a bit of a nuance to it that I'm going to explain in the next slide, but people have theoretically recognized that. And then also Zoltan, and I should say we, but really Zoltan measured a ton of these rivers in the Amazon basin to demonstrate how that works. So more curvature and migration rate correlate kind of, and I say kind of because of the next few slides. So here's a general couple of bends of a meandering river. Radius of curvature is shown here for these two bends in R. And then what Zoltan did here in this cartoon is he took these bends and then he straightened them out. Okay, so you got this straightened segment is a straightened version of these two bends. And so what he plotted here was curvature down the length of the channel here, and when you're looking at the two bends, and then this is what the curvature looks like down the reach of the channel. And so this is just like a plot of distance downstream in the x-axis, and the y-axis is curvature. Okay, so the point of maximum curvature is this black dot here, maximum curvature on the straightened out line is this guy. On the next bend, this is the point of maximum curvature, this is the point of maximum curvature. Okay, but it's not as simple as the point of maximum curvature equals the point of maximum migration. There's a correlation there, but you have to take into account a phase lag between the two measurements. so that's illustrated here. So remember, the black line is the curvature measured along those bends. And the red line that we got here is the migration from the initial time step of the channel center line to the subsequent time step of the channel center line. And you'll see that the point of maximum migration, maximum curvature, excuse me, in black is different than the point of maximum migration. Maximum migration is a little bit downstream of the point of maximum curvature. And the reason behind that is that the velocity that's sort of shearing the outer bend of these channels isn't just a function of the curvature at that one particular location. It's actually a function of the weighted sum of the upstream curvatures. So at this point, the migration that results at this red dot is a result of all these other curvatures upstream. It's not just a result of this more modest curvature at this particular point. So if you take that into account, the weighted sum of all those upstream curvatures, you end up getting this shift in the location of maximum migration relative to maximum curvature. And this is illustrated below in the plot of the straightened out version of the river. Here's the downstream variation in curvature, and then here's the migration, and you can, when you shift it downstream about 2 to 4 channel widths, the curvature and the migration, they exhibit the same trend, right? And so Zoltan demonstrated this for like oodles of rivers in the Amazon basin. Here's one example from his paper that I want to highlight it because we're going to do similar measurements later, and so you will have familiarity with having looked at this diagram before. But this is the Jura River over like 30 years. The blue line is the 1987 channel. 30 years later, that's the red line. That's where the channel is. You can see it's changed from 1987 to 2017. And so what Zoltan measured was he measured we're co-authors on this, but Zoltan did a lot of this heavy lifting, okay? What he's plotted here is the curvature in along this 1987 channel. So that's what this blue plot is here. This is a curvature that's just normalized by the channel width, so it's dimensionless. And then he measured the migration rate from like across the entire river from 1987 to 2017. So that's the red curve. And you can see that there's a lot of similarity in the shape of the red curve and the blue curve, although again, there's this lag, right? There's a lag of about 2 to 4 channel widths from the point of maximum curvature to the point of maximum migration. Okay, so that's kind of how like river kinematics evolution works. So like, how do submarine channels evolve? Is there anything to an analogy from rivers to submarine channels? And basically, like for decades, since people started accumulating high resolution images of submarine channels on continental rises and submarine fans and continental slopes, they've noticed that qualitatively the shapes look the same. This is like, I guess, side scan sonar imagery from the Amazon fan, and you get these sinuous patterns that look a heck of a lot like the sinuous patterns on rivers that you look at in satellite images. And then people have actually measured characteristics of the channels in deep water and rivers and shown that they follow along a similar trend line, like channel width versus meander wavelength, radius of curvature versus meander wavelength, that kind of thing. So the planform geomorphology kind of looks similar, like really similar, and it seems more and more similar the more examples that people find. A great example, like one of my favorite examples for comparing the stratigraphy that's preserved of submarine channel deposits to that of fluvial deposits comes from the Bengal fan, a paper by Venkola in, I don't know, 2012, or it's almost 10 years old now. The Bengal fan's like the biggest pile of sediment in the world, right? And so in the upper part of the fan, they had a seismic survey and some high resolution bathymetry. This white rectangle here is going to be the next slide. So this is what the sinuous pattern of the Bengal canyon channel system looks like. And then the next slide is going to be this white box region, and it's going to show on the left here, this is the shallow seismic stratigraphy of the Bengal Canyon channel system at that location, but just like a few tens or hundreds of meters. I don't know how deep it is below the seafloor. And I'll be darned if it doesn't look a heck of a lot like the preserved stratigraphy and well-imaged and well-characterized fluvial deposits. So on the left is this example from the Bengal Canyon Channel System. This is deep water. And to the right is it's not a natural example, it's a numerical model of meandering that Zoltan developed based on the idea of migration rate being the weighted sum of upstream curvatures. And I think it was published by like Howard and Knudsen in 1984. But Zoltan developed this code called MeanderPy that you can download on GitHub and generate stratigraphy that looks, you can simulate the planform evolution of a fluvial system just like this. And so they look darn similar, right? Just at least qualitatively. So let's take a closer look at submarine channel planform evolution with the question in mind: does the planform evolution show some of the expected characteristics in submarine channels as in rivers, like why or why not? And rather than go into a passive margin environment, let's make it a little bit difficult on ourselves. Let's go to a really dynamic setting, a tectonically active setting. Let's go to a salt basin. Let's go to the Campos. So that's kind of the bulk of this talk, right? So Campos Basin is broadly located here where I've got this dashed square in southeastern Brazil. So that dashed square is this location map right here. And then there, you can read a map, you can see the different features that are present. There's a cross section, AA prime. This is this cross section, AA prime. And like in a lot of passive margins, like particularly like along the Atlantic margin and the conjugate margins, offshore of Africa, offshore of South America, you get more extensional features in the upstream part of these margins. And then usually salt's deposited early during basin formation, and that salt becomes mobile, and you get more extensional to more compressional features as you move further downstream. I can't say exactly where the data, for this presentation, I can't say exactly where the data is that we're working with, but generally it's kind of in this region here. I got this big old arrow here, but I wasn't given permission to show you exactly the region that we're working, but it's kind of in this spot where you start to get really well-developed diapirs, where you're transitioning from these more extensional features to more shortened diapirs and like pillows. A little bit of background about the Campos Basin. This is from a summary of the Atlantic conjugate margin that was published almost 10 years ago now, highlighting the late Cretaceous through tertiary turbidite plays offshore of South America, offshore of Africa. The different big bold lines here represents like proven plays or not necessarily proven plays, but plays that are being evaluated from late Cretaceous through the Paleogene and into the Neogene. The Campos Basin is about here. It's this like where I'm pointing out with an arrow. The size of these circles represents the reserves, the turbidite reservoir, the reserves in turbidite reservoirs. And so the bigger the circle, like the bigger the prize, I guess. And the Campos is a big old circle, so there's a lot of oil and gas there, I guess. And then what you also have plotted against that like more petroleum system context is what the paleogeography might have been like in the Cretaceous. That's what these red lines are. The stippled pattern is more relatively high elevation areas or active tectonic parts of the margin. And the blue lines represent Cenozoic rivers, I think. Yeah, and then also plotted here, I've got some context about for the Campos Basin when there was coastal uplift and denudation, and then correspondingly there's usually margin, continental margin progradation, and so some big episodes of uplift and erosion onshore of some of the small run out, they're actually short but tectonically active rivers in southeastern Brazil. Were happening in the late Cretaceous, a little bit in the Eocene, and then throughout the Neogene. So that's a little bit of where we are and what the tectonic, like the geologic history was. Now let's take a look at these data. So remember, these data are kind of somewhere in deep water, around 2 kilometers water depth, something like that, I think, and then we mapped a series of seismic reflection horizons from about the late Cretaceous all the way to the seafloor. This is one of those late Cretaceous horizons, and so what you're seeing in yellow are salt diapirs, and what you're seeing in purple are basins between the salt diapirs, or low spots where that's like deep water accommodation for sediment deposition between the salt diapirs. So that map that I just showed you, that structure map, is shown in the upper right corner here. And then what I'm going to show you is a series of regional cross sections, like west-east oriented, but from the northern part of the study area to the southern part of the study area. So west-east cross section here is this west-east cross section here. We mapped a region, like across this whole area, we mapped all these seismic reflections that are from old to young, green to yellow. And then we observed some pretty consistent seismic facies like across the entire area of interest. There's these sort of more acoustically transparent domal features and like pillar-like features. This is what salt looks like in seismic reflection data. We also get some of these moderate to low amplitude but very continuous seismic reflections that have variable dips as a result of deformation of the salt. Those are usually beneath the region of the stratigraphy, the seismic stratigraphy that we started to map. And then we have something that's real common and interesting in this data set are a bunch of high amplitude discontinuous seismic reflections all the way to nearly the seafloor. These are all channel deposits. So like since the late Cretaceous, there's been like the stacking of a bunch of channel systems. And I'm going to show you a bunch of map views in a minute about what they all look like. There's also chaotic seismic reflection character. Those are some of those mass transport complexes that result from subaqueous landsliding that I mentioned before. In this case, there's a mass transport complex that pretty much blankets the entire seafloor in the area of interest. So this is a west-east profile here. And I'm going to move, before I go to the next slide, I want to highlight that we wrote a paper recently about some of the channel evolution up in here. This is probably Miocene-aged deposits. And then our graduate student, John Cahan, wrote a master's all about the kinematics and the stratigraphic evolution of the Plio-Pliocene channel systems that you can see here. Okay, so now we're moving kind of more to the south in the study area. You see more of the same. You see that chaotic seismic reflection character. Those are mass transport complexes. You see more of these high amplitude discontinuous seismic reflections. These are probably all, we think they're all channel deposits. And trust me, they're channel deposits. We'll show you map views in a minute. They look like channel deposits, channels. So this is kind of right in the heart of the basin between a couple of salt diapirs. And moving further to the south, you see a little bit, you still see that chaotic mass transport complex character. And then you don't see as many of the channelized looking like seismic reflection character around here, a little bit of it, not too much. Here though, right between these two salt diapirs, there's this little neck, this little bottleneck, and there's a big old stack of almost a kilometer of these high amplitude discontinuous seismic reflections. So it looks like, channels are passing through this basin here, maybe up through here, and then they're all passing through this little bottleneck and stacking vertically for like a kilometer. And so it's probably all like gravels and sands that are commonly in the phthalags of meandering channel systems. Pretty spectacular. Okay, let's move a little bit farther to the south. No more of those high amplitude discontinuous channel deposits. So it seems like when you look at this map view up here in the upper right, that everything's kind of coming to a bottleneck here, and then it's exiting the basins to the southeast. All right, so let's see what that looks like in map view. So there's a section, a generalized section location in dashed line right here, and that's this cartoon seismic, or it's not a seismic reflection profile, it's a cartoon cross section. Just to give you an idea of where we're looking stratigraphically. And then I've color coded all those late Cretaceous to seafloor horizons from old to young, green to yellow. And then you can see the channelized shapes that I have drawn in here. So there's channels kind of through the whole stack. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show an animation from the bottom of this stack all the way to the seafloor. And you can see how the channelized patterns change in map view from bottom to top. So we're starting at the very bottom, and then we're progressively moving up section. Okay, so we're in the late Cretaceous, probably late Cretaceous now. We don't have good age control like I mentioned. And then we're slowly stepping up. I've highlighted some of these channel forms with dashed black lines. You can see how the meandering pattern and migration of the channel, it's real sinuous and it's meandering, but it's like constrained by the location of salt diapirs. Now we're moving into a younger section that might still be late Cretaceous, or it could be Paleocene. I've had arguments with people about the age of this channel system. This is the one we're going to focus on. It's a big old channel system, 10 kilometers for scale, absolutely enormous. Here's a little line drawing trace of what it looks like. Then overlying that, overlying the Oligocene and into the Miocene probably, there are a number of other channel features. They're a little bit smaller than the Cretaceous or the Paleocene ones that I showed you before, but they exhibit some of the same meandering patterns that you know, are hallmarks of submarine channel evolution. And then we're getting into the Plio-Pleistocene section, which is the thin veneer just at the top of the section, and there's a southwest-northeast trending channel. And it's got some pretty wild loops and sinuosity development to it. And then you start to see these more speckled patterns. This is that mass transport complex that's like on the top of the whole pile. That's the seafloor. That's what seafloor looks like. Rough seafloor, and it's because it's the seafloor is the result of all that crazy channelization, diapirism, and mass transport complex emplacement, especially that was occurring more recently and like since the Miocene. So here's all those channel traces that I showed you in the amplitude extraction from the seismic data, all of them plotted one upon the other. I mean, there's like 90 degrees of paleo current like orientation, right? You got the west-east trending channel systems, the southwest to, the northwest to southeast trending ones, the north-south trending ones. The yellow, all the yellow line drawing trace that I have here is the line drawing trace of the channel system that I'm going to focus on for a more detailed kinematic analysis. And then all these pink polygons, that's salt. Okay, those are salt diapirs that are and their current location of the salt diapirs. So we're going to focus on this guy. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at this guy that appears in map view anyway to be exhibiting a heck of a lot of like downstream translation, almost certainly as a result of the, you know, some confinement, and confinement might not be the right word, but some obstruction that's caused by the surrounding salt diapirs. So here's that seafloor again, and let's rotate to look at a more or less west-east oriented strike profile of the system of interest. You know, I mentioned we interpreted all these regional seismic reflection horizons, and then we also interpreted a couple of additional, or 3 additional seismic reflection horizons that define the base, intermediate, and top of that big channel system that I was highlighting before. So what I'm going to show you is first this is a west-east cross section. West is here, east is here, and then I'm going to show you a number of north-south oriented cross sections, so you get an idea of what the west-east, like more of a strike view of the channel system looks like, and then a few depositional dip views of the channel system. And again, it's bounded by the green and the purple. Try not to pay too much attention to all the spectacular additional channelized seismic reflections that surround it. So here's a little line drawing interpretation of where the channel deposits are, picking all the high amplitude discontinuous seismic reflections that reflect the margins that are preserved of some of the channel elements. It exhibits, you know, downstream translation from west to east. Remember, again, keep this in mind, this is a depositional strike view, and downstream is west to east more or less. And then here's what the line drawing trace of the morphology of the channel system looks like. So the reason why you're getting all these like west to east dipping high amplitude channel margins is because that's the direction that the channel is translating downstream. So that's what a strike view looks like. Thicker in the west, thins considerably to the east, probably reflecting differential movement of the salt diapirs that are around the channel system and really sort of constraining its location. Here's the first more upstream north-south profile. That's in that thicker section. Again, we're looking at the seismic reflections from the green to the purple. Here's an interpretation, a line drawing interpretation of the channel stacking. The reason why everything's moving from north to south is because you have early expansion of this channel system from north to south in the upper right corner, and then it degrades quite a bit. Moving a little bit farther downstream, the thickness of this package is less. again, this is a cool seismic reflection profile because it shows you like strike-ish, depositional strike-ish. It's meandering, so it's hard to tell what's strike all the time, but views of underlying channelized deposits that are really big, overlying channel deposits that are really big, and then what we were focusing on here. And there's a little line drawing interpretation. And the reason why it has channel margins that are oriented differently, like this one's a south-north dipping one and then a north-south dipping one, is because you're cutting through either side of a meander loop. It's pretty neat. Kind of bends your mind a little bit to think about like, what am I seeing in cross-section? It really pays to think about this stuff in 3 dimensions. And then further downstream, here's a north-south profile, north-south, and there's a lot less, it's a lot thinner here. There's a lot more uplift of salt diapirs that's probably inhibiting aggregation of the system. And here's what the channelized features look like. So that's kind of what the cross sections look like. Let's look in more detail at map views. So here's the bottom of the system. You can see all these scroll-like patterns similar to like what you expect to see in the deposits of fluvial systems. This is right at the bottom of the system. All these blue and green and yellow polygons are salt diapirs that surround. And then as we move up through the channel system, you still see more of that, that translating pattern, and then you start to vertically, you start to concentrate channels at the, around the locations of where the salt diapirs are. So we didn't just image it and interpret a ton of seismic reflection data. We actually picked the individual center lines of what we thought were channelized features and then reconstructed them because they're not all preserved. You can see that there's a salt diapir, what we call salt diapir 2, that's presently in the location where some of these channels used to trend, but we're kind of interpreting how the channel shape was before the salt diapirs actually led to the erosion of them. Didn't really lead to the erosion of them, but before they were uplifted and then superficial processes eroded the channels away. Okay, so we interpreted a bunch of these center lines, and so the old ones are purple and the young ones are yellow. So before we go into that detail, which will really get at the heart of what this is all about, it's about documenting and analyzing the kinematics of this submarine channel system in plan view and comparing it to rivers. Let's just put these channel elements in context. Like, how big are these things? So we've accumulated like lots of data on rivers and channels, from the biggest channels in the world, the Bengal, that's these pink dots here, to the to typical oil and gas channelized reservoirs. That's these green dots. That's the Dahlia. That's offshore. That's a reservoir offshore Angola. And then we felt really confident in 7 bends that we mapped for these channels. And we mapped them regionally across the entire data set. And so what we did was we measured the common measurements to compare channels, and at least the map view characteristics of channels are meander wavelength and channel width. So we measured those channels in the Campos, and they plot like up here, like these are some of the biggest channels in the world ever measured. And there's a whole story behind that, but there's just not that much context to the Brazilian margin that we can find in the public domain to really link it, like exactly why these channels are as big as they are, beyond like, tectonically uplifting coastal drainages lead to lots of sediment supply. Like that's all. That's about the extent of what we're saying. We're more interested in the kinematic evolution of these giant channels, but I think it's kind of a neat little aspect of it, is that the channels are big. For comparison, so these are the traces of the channel traces that we're like super confident in, that we mapped like line by line in the seismic reflection data, and they're a lot bigger than like the Bengal or the typical oil and gas channelized reservoir element that's offshore West Africa. That's what Dahlia is. That's what Bengal is. Okay, so now let's look at these center lines. Recall again that the center lines are relative to the current position of diapirs. Like obviously the diapirs weren't in these locations at the time of channel formation. That wouldn't make any sense. The channel segments that intersect the diapirs were eroded as the diapirs continued to rise after the channels were formed. So this is the earliest channel. And then just moving on up, notice that the channel belt continues to expand, and it starts to actually like dock up against the location of the current salt bodies. And this is a nice bend there's a bend 1, bend 2, and then this bend here, bend 3, is like stuck against this salt diapir, and watch as it starts to like squeeze closed. It squeezes to the point where it gets cut off, kind of like you see in rivers, right? It cuts off right here. And then that high curvature, tight bend translates downstream a heck of a lot. And this is kind of as predicted by fluvial models of meandering too. And then at the end, the last two channel traces they just kind of get knocked around between these salt diapirs, just following the steepest descent downstream. They don't look nearly as beautifully meandering in a systematic way as what came before. Okay, so we've didn't just interpret all these things. We actually measured the center lines like Zoltan did in the Amazon basin for the Amazon River basin. So what we did, so we have all these lines that we digitized, and then we measured the distance between the successive channel center lines using a dynamic time warping algorithm that Zoltan's been using for correlation a lot. So it just correlates each point along the first center line to the closest point on the second center line. And he uses it for analyzing fluvial systems, deep water channel systems, and even wireline logs, right? So actually Zoltan might be talking about this technique in the context of correlating logs right now at Liverpool. He's giving a talk at the same time as this talk. So remember this diagram, because we're going to look at plots like this for the Campos channel that we observed. Again, you have curvature above that's measured at a initial channel center line, and then the migration rate or migration distance from the initial channel center line to the next is shown below in red. And the key for what we see in rivers that are kind of unperturbed is that the curvature and migration correlate if you consider this lag, this phase lag between the point of maximum curvature and the point of maximum migration. So I'm gonna run through an animation really quick, going through all the time steps that we measured, not talking too much about them. And then I'm going to go into more detail about like 4 time steps that we think are really interesting. So what we're looking at here are, down here are channel center lines, okay? And then the distance between channel center lines. And up here is curvature is in blue, just like in the previous slide. Although it wasn't blue, but just like the same style, right? Like curvatures and above, plotted above. And migration distance is in green down here. And so a key just about this first time step, where the channel probably hasn't expanded to interact too much with the salt diapirs, is that there's this lag. This time is about 2 to 7 channel widths between the point of maximum curvature and the point of maximum curvature and the point of maximum migration along these bends, okay? And that's kind of like what we see in river systems. So I'm just gonna kind of scroll through this. And so the dashed lines are key. Those are places where we think that there's this nice lag that's exhibited between points of maximum curvature and points of maximum migration. But then once the channel expands to the point of actually starting to interact with the salt diapirs and hit the salt diapirs, you don't see nearly as many of those dashed lines. And that's because curvature doesn't seem to be related too much to migration. Here's a cutoff. And then really, after the cutoff, the only place where you see a link between curvature and migration is just associated with this post-cutoff, relatively small bend that's downstream translating between salt diapirs, not interacting with salt diapirs as much. And then this is the last active time step between the two last active center lines, and there's like no relationship between curvature and migration. Okay, so let's take a closer look. So this is that time step 2 that I kind of mentioned before. The initial center line is black, and then the subsequent center line is red. Curvature is in blue up here. Migration is in green, and you can see that we've drawn with these dashed lines. There's this lag between the point of maximum curvature, point of maximum migration. This is kind of where it looks like the submarine channel system is evolving a little bit like an unperturbed river, and that might be because the salt diapirs weren't influencing the meandering pattern as much, because the channel is a little bit straighter. It hasn't quite expanded to the point of interacting with the salt diapirs. A little bit different here. The bends have expanded. This is much later, time step 14. The bends have expanded to the salt diapirs. You can see they're really big now. This bend 1, which I'm calling bend 1, has docked up against this salt body 3. It's also probably confined by this salt body 2. Salt body 5 here is directing the position of the channel. It's not even migrating very much. But you do still see some lag between points of maximum curvature and points of maximum migration associated with this bend 2 here and here. Then you cut off, and I mean, there's like no difference in migration between these two center lines of bend 1 and bend 2. This bend 3A, what I'm calling bend 3A, that's the bend that forms after you cut off. And there is quite a bit of downstream translation to fill in that accommodation. It's rapidly going to translate and exhibit this link between curvature and maximum migration, similar to what we see in rivers. But this is kind of like the only bend that's doing that. Another kind of curious, I'm going to go back and forth between these two time steps. Another kind of curious thing about after this time step 16 is that initially the channel, although the bend 4 expanded to interact with this salt body 4. But then after this time step 16, the bends contract a bunch. So we think that it reflects differential movement of these two salt diapirs 4 and this little limb of salt diapir 5. For example, 5 might have, the salt body 5, this little limb of it might have been uplifted earlier and then promoted some tilting that promoted expansion. And then subsequently, like around now, this one started uplifting and it shifted the epicenter more to the south. And then the final time, looking at the two center lines, the final time step 21, it just kind of getting knocked around the path of steepest descent. It doesn't seem to be meandering like an unperturbed river would at all. Well, let's compare to a river a little bit. Again, early on during the development of the Campos Basin channel system that we interpreted, there was this nice lag between points of maximum curvature and points of maximum migration. And you can see these dashed lines where we try to highlight that. And that, to me, looks a lot. You haven't started to interfere, like the channel system hasn't started to interact as much with the salt diapirs that are confining it. And so it's just kind of meandering like you'd expect it to meander. It looks a little bit like this example from the Jura River, right? Where you get this high curvature correlates with migration rate when you take into account a phase lag. What's quite different is later, after the channels have expanded to interact with those salt diapirs, and the most extreme example of that is the last couple of time steps. Man, the channel is just getting bounced around and trying to make its way downhill as fast as it can. And the salt really inhibits the ability for it to meander like a river. Yeah. And then one other thing I'll mention is once the channel, like the channel system exhibits evidence for a heck of a lot of downstream translation, right? It expands to a point where it starts to interact with the salt diapirs, and then it translates a lot downstream. And that's reflected in these, the orientation of these scroll-like patterns in the cartoon that I've drawn here. And it's really nicely exemplified by this bend, I think this was bend 3, that docks up against this salt diapir, and then it translates and squeezes as it translates until it cuts off. And that behavior is also actually pretty common in rivers that are not just freely meandering across the floodplain, they're actually confined by a less erodible valley wall. So this is an example from a Mamori River again. And this dash box region, I think, is exhibiting the same type of behavior as we see in the Campos Basin that's surrounded by salt diapirs, where you get a heck of a lot of downstream translation because the channel just can't expand against this resistant wall. And that's when that relationship between curvature and migration rate breaks down in rivers, is when you start to incorporate less erodible substrate. Likewise, when a channel starts to interact or be restricted by these salt diapirs, it exhibits some of the same type of behavior. So even though the relationship breaks down, the fact that the influence of less erodible substrate in both submarine and fluvial environments seems to be relatively similar. Here's just a zoom in to those translating deposits and the progressive tightening of the meander loop before it cuts off. And I'll be darned if it doesn't look like the same style, you know? Okay, so these are my concluding slides. We went through this, you know, aggregational channel systems offer the opportunity to produce these time-lapse-like interpretations like we see for rivers and better understand their, at least their plan view kinematics. Is plan view channel, submarine channel evolution similar to rivers? Plan view, I say, because the cross sections can be quite different. As I already said, there's a heck of a lot of aggregation in these submarine channel systems. I'll be darned. I mean, the plan view evolution looks real similar. They're analogous. They're totally analogous. Beyond just qualitative comparisons, we can actually go in and quantify the evolution from one channel segment to the next and demonstrate that some of the same relationships that exist for rivers with respect to their migration exist for submarine channels, until you start to feel, in tectonically active settings, you start to feel the influence of topographic barriers. And then, I mean, their gravity flows, they're stupid. They're just going downhill as fast as they can, and they might not behave in a way that's similar to a river. And that was, but that's not totally unlike how rivers behave when they start to interact with a less erodible substrate. And I show you this example of translating and squeezing meander loops in the Campos and how it's similar to the Memori River when it starts to interact with a less erodible valley wall. Okay, that's kind of a summary of what I talked about. Focused a lot on kinematics of fluvial and submarine channels, and then how salt can influence those kinematics. I'm going to have just a little teaser about some of the more of the stuff that we talked about in this study in the paper that we're revising right now. We also talked generally about salt basin filling, and specifically about how the Campos Basin might be a little bit different than the commonly cited types of basins. And one of the commonly cited types of salt basins is salt withdrawal mini basins, like in the northwestern Gulf of Mexico. So this is the coast of the US, and then this black box is rotated 90 degrees so that north is to the left. And this is the Brazos Trinity Basin 4 salt withdrawal mini basin. And the stratigraphy, or the depositional morphologies that form in the shallow subsurface there, consist of relatively narrow channels that feed weakly confined channels and lobes. It's all surrounded by salt diapirs. And when you look at a cross section, 1 prime is 1 prime here, the fill of the basin is is really layered, right? You get like high amplitude, continuous layers, more acoustically transparent layers, high amplitude, acoustically transparent, high amplitude. This morphology of these channels to weakly confined lobes is approximately in the most shallow part of this seismic reflection profile here. That's a heck of a lot different than we see in the in the Campos Basin. This is the horizon at the top of the channel system that we mapped. You can kind of see the depression that defines the last active channel system, salt diapirs everywhere. So it's surrounded by diapirs, but the morphology of deposits is gigantic channels, right? And then when you look at a cross section, 2 prime, 2 prime. So we're focused on this area here between the green and the purple horizon. There's a bunch of laterally offset channel deposits, and then corresponding levee overbank strata, and then immediately overlying it, immediately below it, it's all just big old channel systems. And it could have something to do to the upstream characteristics of the sediment routing system here in the Campos, these high sediment yield coastal mountain belts that promoted a heck of a lot of margin progradation during the Cretaceous and through the Tertiary, led to the development of dominantly channel and channel overbank stratigraphy compared to what you see in like the commonly cited models of salt withdrawal mini basin filling. So yeah, that's it. That's the end of the talk. And then again, I just end on this kind of slick animation that that we made that shows the transition from us moving to having recognized these in seismic reflection data to actually mapping them in 3D and then analyzing them in a lot of detail. So yeah, I think anybody who's in control here. Yeah, thanks.
Me. This would be me. Jake, thank you very much for this extremely visual talk, and it was really feast for the eye, I have to say, and for my geological imagination. So yes, the stage is open for questions right now. I imagine that probably our viewers need some time for typing. I have a question myself, but actually before I will ask it, I can use the time right now, if you don't mind. And I can remind you all that next week there will be no webinar, but instead we will have something else ready for you. And this is a Carbonate Forum, 2 days of Carbonate Forum on the 11th and 12th of May. And the Carbonate Forum brings together scientists working on carbonates to foster discussion and share knowledge ideas. And the idea is that it's basically targeted for early career scientists. So in case if you didn't register yet and your heart beats faster when you think about carbonates, please do. And of course, it's free of charge. So that's done. I won't be able to forget it any longer. And right now I see, well, my question will have to wait because there are questions for you, Jake, from the audience. Oh, cool. So Jeffrey is asking, and he's asking from Denver. Yes, please remember to write where you're watching us from. Here's a basic question. What initiates meandering sinuosity in deepwater channels? Why don't sediment or set gravity flows simply move straight down slope, down gradient?
Yeah. Well, like I mentioned, is that Jeff May? Hey, I think I know you. Anyway, so yeah, like I mentioned, gravity flows are stupid. They just go straight downhill, and if the slope is steep enough, then they produce pretty straight channelized features. But the more gravity flows that move through, like initially, a lot of these submarine channels, kind of the way that we think about them, and especially you can see this in the aggregational ones where you can track the centerline evolution. They start off kind of straight too, actually, and then it's only after a lot of time and a lot of gravity flows moving through them that you start to develop progressively more sinuosity. That's actually also one of the reasons why there's a big architectural difference between more weakly, what we call like weakly confined channels, and these more some confined channel systems on the slope that are the locus of a lot of gravity flows over a long period of time. And in the more weakly confined examples, they tend to be really straight, and that's because they like initiate, they form, they're relatively low relief, and then there's an avulsion upstream quickly after they form, and then they form a new one, and then they form a new one. There's just not enough time for, there's not enough maturity inherent to those types of weakly confined channels, not enough gravity flows moving through them for long enough time to develop the type of sinuosity that we see here. And you'll notice in the cartoon, you can see it for yourself, like it's a lower sinuosity thing, and then it becomes a lot more sinuous until its sinuosity can't increase anymore because it's confined by those salt diapirs. So I hope that answers Jeff's question.
I will just move to the next question from Bill from Ottawa. Great talk, Jake, and spectacularly illustrated. Yeah, I guess that we all agree on that. When you remove vertical exaggeration, what is the typical angle of climb of the channel trajectory? Also, do you see any systematic change in the angle, possibly related to progressiveness of salt diapirism?
Yeah, that's awesome. But I expect that from Bill. I don't know. I can't remember what the exact angle is. It's low, man. Like all these cross sections, like people that work in seismic, we tend to vertically exaggerate stuff quite a bit, and that's so that things look more spectacular, and so you can fit stuff on a screen. But yeah, I mean, it's like not much more than a degree or a few degrees or whatever. But yeah, I think that I think that you can, that's the other aspect of this work that I didn't really get into because it's just, there's so much to this, is that you can use the kinematics of the channel system, not just its planform kinematics, but then also, it's aggregational trajectory to help to understand the, to reconstruct the salt movement. It's like growth strata, really. So that's what we're trying to advocate by more detailed three-dimensional characterization of these channels, is that it can lead you to understand the relative movement of different structures too. Beyond just like, the classic way is to look at like wedges, wedges and big seismic reflection packages, but you can also look at the details of the seismic, and we do that in the paper too. So stay tuned, man. Great point.
The next question and the next praise is from Zoe from Norway. Incredible presentation, Jake. Thank you. Those images and animations are wow. You compared flat, unconfined rivers with these topographically salt-influenced submarine channels. Are there any examples of salt topographically influenced rivers? And how do these compare to your observations and evolution in the submarine?
Yeah, that's a good question. Dang it. Yeah, so I was looking around. So the reason I use Memore is because Zoltan characterized the crud out of it a lot, and there are stretches of it where it interacts with the less erodible bank that look a heck of a lot like segments of this this Campos Basin example. So that's kind of why I use that by convenience. But I was looking around, like I ran like Google Earth and Google Earth Engine for examples in places with salt, like in Iran and in like the Popa Basin in northern Mexico, and I couldn't find anything that, I mean, there are rivers and stuff, like dryland rivers and all that, but I couldn't find a good example that exhibited like a systematic evolution, like what we were able to interpret in the subsurface in the Campos. So yeah, I've looked, haven't found anything. It's not that it's not there, it's just me being kind of lame and not being able to find it after looking for a little bit, after looking for a couple afternoons. But if you have an example, please please do share. I don't have my email here, but it's I'll type it in the chat actually. It's jake.kovalt@beg.utexas.edu. So if anybody has any comments or questions, or you can direct me on Twitter. I'm the administrator of the Clastics Lab Twitter handle. So.
Okay, the next question is from Rahat from Egypt, and obviously he congratulates on the excellent talk, Jake, and would like to know, how do you see the Mediterranean basin as submarine channels, and whether they are similar to any of the examples you showed us?
So I don't know. I mean, I know as much as probably anybody, I guess, about, or less, not as much as many. Anyway, I don't know a lot about the Mediterranean is what I'm trying to see, but I have like looked at the seafloor there, and in particular been interested in like the Ebro margin and the Gulf of Leon, because those are where the best developed channels form, and like the Var is like super famous, so I'm like aware of these famous ones. I mean, they develop sinuosity too. This is kind of unique. Like these channels are enormous, and they're so big they like dwarf the size of the salt diapirs and the salt basins. But there is sinuosity to the channels on the seafloor, at least in the Mediterranean, that I've seen. That said, it's also, there are steeper segments of the margin that end up having like a lot straighter. So I mean, I guess that doesn't really answer your question too much, other than like, submarine channels tend to exhibit sinuosity. It's just kind of a natural, if enough flows are passing through channels to develop sinuosity, like they're gonna have the same flavor. And I imagine Mediterranean is not any different, but I'd love to see if somebody has a lead on data or something. I'd love to see some. I haven't really looked in the subsurface Mediterranean. Oh, the Nile, shoot, that's like a big old passive margin fan, right? That has sinuous channels to it, and there's been a number of papers that have been focused on it. So again, nothing as big as these, because these are really big.
Yeah, you mentioned that they're like really oversized.
Yeah, that was like in the paper. So we try to focus the paper on the kinematic evolution of the channels because that's like new to measure channels, submarine channels like that. But it is kind of like, what is the expression? The elephant in the room or something? It's like, these channels are so big, like everybody's curious about like, why the heck are the channels so big? Can you provide more context for the upstream characteristics of the margin that lead to such big channels? And we're developing a discussion to elaborate on that a bit, but there's just not as much information as I'd like. And our time control to try to correlate the development of these with events that are happening onshore is just really poor. We're not like an oil company with a bunch of micropaleontologic data constrain the age more precisely than we have. So, sorry.
With time control, you have just hit my question, but it can still wait because there are a lot of questions in the chat and they're rather long. Next one is from Valentin from Oslo. I second Ola and everyone else about the quality of the presentation and 3 exclamation marks. I was wondering if the lag you measured in your dataset changes with changing rate of aggregation of these channels. When disagreeing with...
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm getting it now. I'm getting the question. Yeah. I'm sorry to get excited about it. Yeah, that's an awesome question. Very cool question. So a thought is that submarine channels only meander when they're incising or when they're at this equilibrium phase where they're just predominantly bypassing sediment downstream. But shoot, they still meander as they grade. There's cutoffs at the tops of some of these channel systems. We got a student named Paul Morris who is working on that first example that I showed from the Gulf of Mexico. That's a beautiful aggregational channel levee system with beautiful gull wing levees. So it's the same data set actually. That image is not from the same data set, but it's the same. He's working on a data set it's the same data set that Frank Peel presented on last week, but he was presenting on like the base salt and we're presenting on like the seafloor. Anyway, so he's mapped out all these channel center lines in a heck of a lot of detail, and the sinuosity continues to increase as the channel system aggrades, and it doesn't slow down or anything. So to kind of answer your question, the changes with the changer. Yeah, like the channel system continues to behave in a meandering way as I'm meandering with this answer. But moreover, Paul and also a former master's student of ours named Indre Altman has been working with Zoltan to do a similar quantification that we just did for this system. And yeah, the last few channel elements that are deposited in that system show the same relationship between curvature and migration rate. That is, they're correlated if you consider a lag. So that's like the answer to your question, sorry. But I just want to highlight, like, there's this thought out there that channels are great and then they just like lock in place, and like maybe sometimes, but not all the time, at least. A lot of the systems that we've been measuring, they don't do that. So here they kind of do it because there are salt diapirs. They can't go anywhere, you know. Sorry, okay.
All right, next question is rather long, and today I'm using online version of Zoom and I can't really stretch my chat, which means that the question is, the online version is hyphenating words in most incredible places. So please bear with me when I will be reading it really weirdly. I'm trying my best. So here comes the question first. Gil, writing from England right now. Such an excellent talk. I'm particularly interested in the difference between the Gulf and Campos Basin fill. I suspect it may give us an important clue to fast rates of structural growth during very high sedimentation flux times in the Campos. In comparison, when the sediment flux picks up in the northern GOM, the structures don't keep up and get overwhelmed by sediment surface rise, particularly in the Pleistocene. Does this say something about the regional slopes and speed of gravity-driven structural processes in the Campos at the time of super rapid slope progradation, and aggregation. I look forward to talking with you about this further, but would like to suggest dynamic topography, may play a part in speeding up the rate of structural growth. Thinking aloud here, so forgive the rather bad phrasing, and please, dear audience, forgive me this rather awkward reading.
No, that was awesome. That was very good, because that's a lot. Like, I don't know, is that like one question? No, Jill, I love it, man. I love it from Jill. So, yeah, I look forward to talking to you, later about this. You know that I'm kind of only fixating on the last part about the dynamic topography. I know that you're really interested in that and that you have ideas about dynamic topography playing a role in the evolution of a variety of margins. And in the past, the first time I gave a talk like this was like 2 years ago, and we hadn't done all the interpretation yet. We were just kind of like had some cool images and then some arm waving about like some of the geologic setting. And we highlighted a lot the influence of dynamic topographic uplift of the coast on promoting some of the exhumation, consequent denudation, and sediment delivery to create such large submarine channels. So yeah, I think that has something to do with it. It's just kind of like we got a lot of pushback about that in review rounds, because that's not really the focus of our study. Like, we've got seismic, so we got to we provide it in its geologic context, but we don't right now we're trying to focus this a little bit more on the kinematics. So yeah, it plays a role, like, no question. And I think it's an underappreciated role, as you know, and you're a big advocate for people thinking a lot more about it. So, so yeah, looking forward to talking to you more about it. I'm sure you remember the talk from a couple of years ago too. And I remember your comments about it then. Okay, I think that kind of addresses it. There was a question about like sediment supply in the northern Gulf of Mexico versus the Campos. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the relative sedimentation was. I mean, like the comparative sedimentation was in the northwestern Gulf versus here. The Brazos Trinity system is pretty well characterized. There's good age control published by Carlos Pirmez in 2012, at least, if not like any of the papers that came before about this system from the ExxonMobil group or from like Twitchell and all these other folks. I know Pirmez's work constrains the age of basin filling and sedimentation rates in all the different basins along the Brazos Trinity system pretty darn well. My sense is that the discharge through the Campos is like way more than in the Gulf of Mexico, because the cross-sectional area of the channels is like, out of this world different. But yeah, I mean, I guess it all boils down to the relative rate of structural deformation and diaperism compared to in this case, the migration of the channel system as well as its aggregation. So, but I think that it's probably pretty high sedimentation rates, and if not sedimentation rates in terms of like aggregation, there's a lot of throughput of sediment in the Campos beyond this site, where this little postage stamp of site where we have data. And I think that you've actually looked at, Jill, you've looked at data like further downstream and have a better idea of the fans that are fed by these channels too. So you probably have even more secret knowledge that you could share with me next time you're at the BEG, whenever you all come by. Okay.
Next question is from Stan from Krakow in Poland. Thanks, Jake. Great talk. The question is much shorter right now, so I will have less troubles reading it, I guess. I would be glad to hear what is known about the type of sediment filling the channels you have investigated, and have you investigated to what extent the type of sediment influences the pattern of channel migration?
Cool. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we don't have good age control. There's no wells that we have no well data that we have access to, so we don't know precisely what the grain size is through these channels. That said, there's contextual insight into sediment being provided to the Campos Basin and the deep water reservoirs therein by a variety of papers, which I'm blanking on right now, which I talk about in the paper. If you want to know more about that, send me an email and I'll send you the paper itself, but I cannot remember for the life of me what the heck the paper is, but there's one that did like all this petrography on reservoirs that were up dip of this system. And it might not be directly feeding this channel system, but it's the same like age. It spans the same age, and it's actually through the Cretaceous to the Cenozoic. Gosh, I wish I could remember what it was. Malorino maybe, or I don't know. Anyway, they provide insights. It's like relatively coarse grain sediment. I imagine it's meandering. It's so big and it's meandering so much that it's probably pretty darn coarse sediment caliber, like gravels and cobbles in there. Well, I won't talk about, when I was at Chevron, we worked the Campos Basin a little bit, and I remember what the cores look like for, I'm not going to say anything more than that. I've seen some core from the Campos Basin of deep water channel deposits. I'm not going to tell you what their age is, but it had like a spectrum. Something you can say from the seismic character is that when you get more of a homogeneous character, it implies that there's not very much difference, and acoustically transparent or low amplitude, very continuous seismic reflection horizons tend to correlate with mud and usually like hemipelagic sediment falling out of suspension. And then when you get higher amplitude seismic reflections, it implies some contrast with that background sedimentation and just contrast within the channel fills themselves. And so the contrast implies that there's a variety of sediment caliber from sand to mud. And in these types of systems, the sand, usually the coarsest grain sand is restricted to the channel foul wag, the deepest part of the channel, and then that stacks up, especially in a nicely organized meandering system like this. Those guys stack up, and then they're bounded by levee overbank deposits that are a little bit finer, and then the finest sediment would be like hemipelagic sediment that's just falling out of the water column from suspension. Have I investigated to what extent the sediment influences the pattern? Yeah, I think that these are probably like in my experience, the coarser grain size correlates with some of the bigger channelized elements and lateral accretion of those elements.
And I think that Bill from Ottawa can do another question.
Cool.
So where the channel migrate along the salt diapers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sorry.
Where you expect? Still, please let me read it for
I know, I'm sorry, I'm excited.
For the recording. I will try again, I lost my point. Where the channel migrate along the salt diapers, might you expect mud-rich counterpoint bar like in many fluvial systems? Any evidence in the seismic amplitude?
Yeah, I didn't. So yeah, like you know that Bill knows, he's like a deep water expert, right? So, and he's also I don't know, he's a sedimentologist expert, but yeah, the counterpoint bars tend to be a lot more muddy, and they're kind of neat in the, you can see counterpoint, like Zoltan just had a paper, I'm like pumping up Zoltan on this talk or whatever, but Zoltan had a paper that just came out in GSA Bulletin on a counterpoint bar development, and he has like a counterpoint bar index that is based on when the curvature and migration rate vectors are in opposite directions. That's when you get counterpoint bars, and they tend to be a lot more muddy. And in some of this Landsat imagery, they form lakes because they're like empty, and they're just like, because the channel's moving so fast as these counterpoint bars are forming that that commonly is expressed in Landsat imagery as like a lake. So and they tend to be fine grained as well. And there's some cool outcrop examples that like Paul Durkin's worked on, and others. I'm probably missing people, forgive me for being ignorant. Anyway, the point is yeah, they're fine grained. In deep water, we don't see much difference in amplitude that suggests one way or the other. Again, these data, I didn't talk, these are data in depth, but the wavelengths are like really big. They're like 100 meters or something like that. So, you know, I don't think that the seismic and the amplitude extractions that I'm showing you, which give the best images of the channel morphology, they're like averaged over a huge area or a huge thickness. So we're not really seeing, we've looked for it, but it wasn't obvious to us. So yeah, to answer your question, evidence in seismic amplitude, we've looked and we haven't found it yet. Doesn't mean it's not there. It just means we haven't found it. So, but that's an awesome question. That's a question we get too. It's like, who cares about the counterpoint bar deposits in deep water? especially from applied people, if it's not muddy or sandy, if it's the same fill, then who cares? But yeah, we don't know. We don't know yet. Somebody needs to drop a core in there, drop a well in there, and take a core.
Yeah, so I think we can slowly close this webinar. Dear audience, thank you very much for attending. Just a very last information. The seminar from last week will be available online from tomorrow, and we apologize for the delay. And this one will be probably also available very soon, next week, in the beginning of the next week. So yes, thank you very much for joining us. Please keep in mind the Carbonate Forum next week, and next talk will be here in 2 weeks, the same time, the same place. Thank you very much.